Hello everybody. Hope I'm back. Hope your dinner was good. My salmon was very tasty. Dessert was fantastic. If I could have your attention, I would like to get the program started here. But before we begin, I just, Mr. Blum taught me one thing. He says, every opportunity is a fundraising opportunity. So just a gentle reminder, the QR codes and the envelopes on the table. So anyway, that's my fundraising pitch for the evening. At my family home in Darjeeling, where I grew up, we had a room. And in that room, there was a wall full of portraits of all climbers from the 1920s up to the 60s. Many of whom were my father's contemporaries. The first two photos I remember as a child were those of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine. And from time to time, my father would have visitors, and I'd hear them mumbling these two names. I never actually imagined that 100 years after the 1924 expedition, I would be in the same room this evening with 3 generations of Mallorys. So please join me in welcoming George Mallory's grandson, Rick Milliken. Rick, if you could please stand. Rick. Rick's lovely wife, Marlene, is here as well. Dr. Emily Key, where are you? Please stand up. And grandson Jack. Also, Rick's son and daughter-in-law, Matt and Amy Milliken, are here, so welcome. Yeah, this is truly a special evening. And sitting with them is also Jake Morton, who was part of the search team along with Conrad, who located Mallory. Jake, please stick to the camera. So the timing of this evening's event, could not have been, I guess, better planned. As many of you have read in the news that climbers of the north face of Everest in Tibet found Sandy Irvine's boot, bringing relief and closure 100 years ago, just as to Rick and family and to loved ones. And I hope in time that the same will be possible for the 200 climbers whose remains are still on the mountain. This evening, we're also joined by Mark Fisher. And Mark was a member of the recent team that found Sandy Irvine's boot. Mark, if you would please stand up and tell us where you are. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. We're also very fortunate this evening that Judy Klein, expedition MD on the recent expedition, she was responsible for taking the socks and bone DNA sample analysis. Judy, where are you? Thank you, Judy. And between Conrad, who's waiting in the wings here, Mark and Wade Davis, I think we'll have many answers to this 100-year-old mystery this evening. So let me extend a warm welcome to AHF Director, climber, explorer, great guy, Conrad Anker, who in 1999 was part of the search team that located Mallory. Conrad?
Okay, how's everyone doing? Really good or just hey? Okay, we're all going to stand up. We're going to stretch. We're going to say hello to the people sitting next to you. If you can't stand up, I understand, but this is your chance to stretch for a bit because you've been eating and you're about to watch more slideshows. There we go. All it takes is 15 seconds. Get the blood going. You'll be better prepared to listen to Mark and Wade. So this is sort of like a Coachella thing, right? Everyone's having a good time. But yeah. So we'll bring it back to the conversation. Those conversations that you started are best afterwards, after you hear more of what's going on. So imagine here we are 100 years later, from 1924. It was on the June of 8th that two climbers from the pioneering English expedition disappeared on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, moving expeditiously as if to make up for lost time. In 1999, I was invited on an expedition by our friend Dave Hahn, and Jake Norton was part of that team. And we sort of had no idea what we were setting out to do, and it was a needle in the haystack. And on a personal level, I was like, hey, I got to go to Everest. It's a free trip, but I didn't think it was ever going to come of it. But there we were. In 1999, it was the cusp of the internet. We were just able to send photographs digitally. The news was still print and sort of regulated by 3 or 4 news outfits. It wasn't this free-for-all that we have now. And we didn't understand the import that this discovery had had. And when the news went around the world, and the next morning everyone walked up to us at base camp, Jake remembers this, and they're like, hey, your team found Mallory, and you didn't tell us. And we're like, well, yeah, we didn't, but it's on the news. So there was all this other stuff. So this past summer, I was working with Mark and Judy and the team that was on Everest, and my work was based here in the United States, and I got a call. They said, hey, you need to get to the phone. I'm like, okay, I'll get to the phone. They're like, but we need to film you on the phone call. I'm like, okay. Get my friend who comes over, we have coffee, and when the news came to me, I was just overwhelmed with sort of happiness and elation. One was that bringing closure to the story of Sandy Irvine and his family. Julie Summers, grandniece, has been a historian. For their family to have conclusion on this was really important, and that it doesn't necessarily open up more questions whether or not they made it to the summit, but what they're doing and why they were doing that up there. And these questions of the why we go do it is sort of fundamental to, in a sense, what we're all doing here this evening. And to illustrate this, we have 2 speakers tonight. The first one is Mark Synnott, who's a longtime friend of mine going back decades, and climbing in Yosemite and around the world, shared experiences in Baffin and places like that. Mark is a very well-known in the climbing community for finding the most obscure, hidden, climbing areas no one's ever heard of, and Mark finds them. And so it's research in some old maps back when we could do that stuff. But he's also an explorer, having recently sailed his boat and written a book about the Northwest Passage. 5 years ago, in 2019, Mark, along with Renan Osterk and a team of climbers, went up and had the most recent expedition that was looking for the body of Sandy Irvine. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark to the stage, and we'll give him a warm San Francisco welcome. This is his first time in the Himalayan Foundation's Give It Up!
Thank you, Conrad, and thanks to the American Himalayan Foundation for having me here. It's really an honor. I feel like I'm here because of Conrad. I don't know exactly how I ended up here tonight, but I'm definitely really honored to be here. Also, I guess I didn't quite realize that. I feel like I'm the opening act for Wade Davis. And that is a huge honor. Wade is definitely a hero of mine, and so yeah, I'm so glad to be here tonight. I think, like some of the people in this audience, am a guy who's in his mid-50s, and what that means is that I came of age as a climber in the 1990s. And the 1990s, as I think a lot of you know, is when John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, was published. I was living under a rock in Yosemite when that book came out, and I remember a copy making the rounds in Camp 4, which I read, and it's an incredible story, as we all know. But it was also sort of a condemnation of what was going on in Everest. You have the commercialization of the mountain, the garbage, the ego, some of those things that John talked about. And I would say that reading that when I did, at the point that I was at in my climbing career, it had a really formative influence on me, and I think it really kind of changed my trajectory as a climber. I feel like there was definitely a chance that I was heading towards Everest at that point. But as Conrad kind of mentioned, the whole reason why I kind of veered off towards going towards more obscure stuff was because of the fact that I wanted to head as far away as I could get from Mount Everest and what it represented, and my understanding of that was what I learned from John's book. I felt like it kind of represented sort of the less noble aspects of what climbing is all about. So yeah, I kind of like made this left turn out into going for more obscure stuff. Most of the mountains that I have climbed, and I am, I think, kind of a diehard climber still to this day, are all stuff that probably most people haven't heard of. And that was a pretty intentional thing to try to, get away from something that I think a lot of people, not just me, but a lot of climbers of my generation, and I think maybe even the generation after me, felt like Everest had been a bit tainted by some of the stuff that was going on there. What happened though for me was that it wasn't just the mountain that I turned away from, but I actually turned away from the history. And for me, that's kind of a big deal, because I think I'm not really a historian. I guess I'm sort of an amateur historian, but I love history, all different kinds of history, but especially climbing history. I've studied it, but I didn't even realize for a while that I was not studying Everest climbing history. And I think there was a reason behind that. And by doing that, I feel like without knowing it, I was doing myself a disservice, because I was not looking at some of the most important history in our sport. And as you know, there was about 70 years between the first attempts on Everest in the 1920s and the 1990s was kind of the decade that John wrote about in Into Thin Air. And that was a really proud decade where a lot of amazing things happened on the mountain. And I hadn't really paid as much attention to that as I could have. Part of that was that I was kind of ignoring the mountain a little bit. I came around, and the reason why that happened, I think, is, and this is a bizarre coincidence, is because of Wade Davis. And I think it's strange that those two guys are sitting there right next to each other, but it was Wade's book, Into the Silence, that kind of snapped me out of it. And reading about all the early history of Mount Everest in the 1920s made me realize that these guys really embodied the spirit of adventure and the spirit of climbing, which is what's always been the most attractive part of the sport to me, and what really drew me into it. And so, yeah, thank you, Wade, for doing that book. It also had a huge formative influence on me. I thought a lot about it, as I am a writer, and I guess I could have sat at home and I could have, done research and written a book, but I knew there was no possible way that that was something that you could do after what Wade had done. I'm also into kind of like this idea of like immersing myself in the story. And so I kind of realized that if I wanted to keep exploring this subject and looking for my own connection to the spirits of Mallory and Irvine, that the best way for me to do that was to go to the mountain and to try to follow in their footsteps. So instead of continuing to kind of research it from home, I decided that I would try to lead my own expedition, as Conrad referenced. And so in 2019, I launched this idea where we would go to Everest to see if we could find the body of Sandy Irvine, to find his remains, and possibly to find the camera that he's believed to have been carrying. When Conrad and Jake and some others found Mallory in 1999, he didn't have the camera on him. And I think everybody had kind of maybe at that point thought that Mallory would have the camera, but when he didn't, it became sort of obvious, well, actually, yeah, that makes sense that he didn't have it. Sandy was more of the tinkerer and the engineer, and Mallory was really the star of the show, so it would make sense that Sandy was carrying the camera. So I think ever since 1999, people have been thinking that if they could find Sandy, then you could find the camera. And so that's what our expedition was based on in 2019. It was a project that was sponsored by National Geographic. We made a film about this. I think it's called Lost on Everest. The idea behind what we were doing was all based on some eyewitness testimony, mostly from a Chinese climber who was part of the first ascent team from 1960, and his name was Xu Zhang. And Xu Zhang talked about finding the body high on Mount Everest. I think maybe he said that it was around 8,200 meters. There have actually been some other eyewitness sightings since then. There was one in 1975, there was another one in 1995. And so we used that as our basis. We did a bunch of analysis looking at aerial photos of the mountain to try to figure out where they might have found that body. And we came up with a GPS waypoint. And the whole sort of purpose of the expedition was to go to that spot and to see if we could find Sandy and we could find the camera. As a lot of you know, the technicians at Eastman Kodak have said that if you could find the camera, it having been deep frozen for, all the years since, now 100 years, they thought there's a good possibility that the film could be salvageable. And that if you could develop that film, it could possibly rewrite history. When I pitched this story to National Geographic, I said to my editor, okay, we think we have a waypoint, we might know where the body is. Imagine if we find it, we find the camera, we develop the film, and there's this moment where the pictures are materializing in the slide tray, and you're not there because you didn't sponsor us. Conrad knows this person. He was like, oh my God, I would be fired if I did that. Like, we can't take that chance. So we got the expedition sponsored by National Geographic. I guess not really a secret, but something I thought about today when I was thinking about what I would say to you guys here tonight was that I also even though I was supposed to not care about Everest because I had told myself that that wasn't something that I should be interested in as a climber, despite all that, I was super keenly interested in the mountain, and I thought about it a lot, and I wondered about what it's like up at the highest point on planet Earth. And I never told anyone about this, I don't think, but I have had this dream, and I still have it now, where I'm climbing Mount Everest. And in that dream, and I don't know if some of you have had this, but I bet some of you have. And in that dream, I'm never on the summit, but I'm always like close to the summit, and I'm trying to get there. And I'm on that last little bit. And I think that kind of embodies what climbing is all about, like being in the thrall of a climb and not knowing if you're going to get to the top. That's kind of the essence of, I think, what climbing is all about. And that's this recurring dream that I always had. So all of this kind of came together when I got this opportunity to go to the mountain in 2019. One of the things that we did as a way to kind of make it easier for us on the mountain was to use drones to search. And this was a brand new thing that nobody had really done before. It wasn't really possible, I don't think, up until that point to fly drones that high. It was like a very brand new thing. As Conrad mentioned, I was partnered with a guy named Renan Ozturk. He figured out how to make the drones fly very, very high. He took all of these amazing images that you're looking at. Renan flew the drone up over the summit of the mountain, and this was in 2019. I really don't think anyone had ever done that before. And one of the things that he did was that he set the drone up so it would fly these grid patterns over the mountain. It would take all these sequential photographs, and those photographs then could be stitched together into this giant, crazy image that shows the whole north face of the mountain. That image, by the way, exists. National Geographic has it. I don't know if there's anyone here from National Geographic. They said they were going to put it out there and they were going to share it. It's like sitting on some hard drive somewhere. And it still hasn't been shared publicly, but it's incredible. I have seen it. I don't have a copy of it, but when you zoom in on it, you can literally see pebbles. So I feel like it's something that should be put out in the public domain so that we can all look at it and we can search and we can see, what might be up there. We did a lot of stuff on this expedition, and I only have a few minutes, and by the way, this talk is super brief, it's almost over. But I won't tell all the story, but it culminated with me trying to go to this spot that we had figured out, this GPS waypoint that we had. And so I left the fixed ropes at about 27,700 feet and quested out to find this spot where we thought that Sandy might be located. As you probably all realized, he wasn't there. Turns out he was down on the central Rongbuk Glacier. We didn't know that until about a week ago. I'm currently living on a boat. I recently came through the Bay Area. Now I'm down in San Diego. I was on Catalina Island and I opened up my phone, which had completely blown up, and I saw a picture of my old friend Jimmy Chin standing over this boot that had a picture with the sock. And yes, I couldn't believe it. My initial feeling was one of, I would say, like intense relief. Like Sandy isn't missing anymore. And I would say that that's something that I cared a lot about from all the time that I had invested in this story. And from following in Sandy and George Mallory's footsteps all the way up Mount Everest, I I think I came close to sort of touching or getting a glimpse of the spirit that drove them up the mountain. And I think it's the same spirit that has driven me up a lot of mountains. And so I felt relief knowing that he wasn't missing anymore. We know where he is. I also felt relief, though, that the mystery wasn't solved. And it took me a little bit to realize that. It felt good that we still don't know what happened. Because we don't know, we're all left to sort of have our own vision of what we think might have happened. And for me, that's a vision of these two intrepid climbers still going strong for the summit, despite the late hour of the day and the odds being stacked terribly against them. As a lot of you know, Mallory has, I think, the most famous quote in mountaineering, which is that when he was asked, why do you want to climb Mount Everest? And he said, because it's there. And that's, I think, the most famous quote because no one really knows what he meant when he said it. But later, he was asked the same question, and he gave a more nuanced answer, and he said, for the stone from the summit, for the geologist, for the knowledge of the limits of human endurance for the doctor, but above all, for the spirit of adventure to keep alive the soul of man. And I love that quote. I love that quote because I feel like the spirit of adventure is why I'm here tonight and why I'm here up on the stage. I feel like it's something that's inside of me, and I think it's something that it's inside of all of you. And I think it also connects us back, all of us, back to Mallory and Irvine, which is why the reason we're here tonight, to celebrate their spirits 100 years later. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Mark. I also got to give a shout out to my friend Conrad. He didn't explain, but in 1999, when he found the body of Mallory, they had all these experts, really smart people, who figured out where in this grid Mallory would be found. And Jake and others were up there looking for him. And Conrad, with his unparalleled mountain sense and experience, looked at the terrain and figured, no, I think he's not there. I think he might be down there. And it was Conrad's mountain sense and expertise, unmatched, and I really mean that led to that incredible discovery. So Conrad was incredible. So enough about Conrad. If you're only going to read one Everest book in your life, I'd like to be able to tell you that you should read mine. But in good conscience, I can't do that. The book you should read is Into the Silence by Wade Davis. Now, Wade, I know from what he's written and said in public speeches, he's not really that interested in whether or not Mallory and Irvine reached the summit. What he cares about and cared about when he wrote Into the Silence was to gain insights into who these guys were, what made them tick, what drove them to endure so much suffering and ultimately sacrifice their lives to climb this mountain. And his book is amazing. You should fucking read his book. Here's Wade now.
Wow. Well, I think the first thing I should say is a troll on the internet once went after me saying, "Into the silence, you just stole it from Krakauer." And the thing is that was actually an insult to John, because it so underestimated his influence in the process that led to the writing of Into the Silence. The title was like naming your kids, it's hard. And I'd worked 12 years on that book. The absolute cutoff deadline to name the book was the next morning in New York, and I hadn't even thought about it. Well, when in doubt, open a bottle of wine, put on Van Morrison, and it's got that great tune, Hymns to the Silence, right? And that came on the CD, and I thought, wow, from the noise of the battlefield to the silence of the plateau. And that was the genesis of the title. But John's influence was much more profound than that, because the whole thing began in the spring of 1996, when I traveled 4,000 miles from Chengdu to Lhasa and on to Kathmandu. We had just concocted this kind of thing called the Sino-American Ecological Survey, which was just a front to allow us to get permits to go through southeastern Tibet as botanists and ornithologists. We went by Everest during the season that John so powerfully wrote about, and we arrived in Kathmandu. It was at the talk of the town, and by the next season, by chance, Dan Taylor, who had led that expedition, invited me back into the Gama Valley on the east face of Everest, the legendary Kanchum face, on this kind of quixotic quest to photograph clouded leopards in the Arun Valley and snow leopards high on the mountain. And one day, as we were camped out at Petanringbo, where you're standing on ground higher than any summit in Europe and looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice rising up the Kanchum face to the South Pole with Lhotse and Everest. Suddenly Daniel began, who'd been very disturbed by the commercialization of the mountain, because he had been nursed on Everest. His father was one of Howard Somerville's great friends, Mallory's closest friend on the mountain. And so he was disturbed by what had happened. And suddenly, the next year, as we looked up at this face of ice, he began to speak of these Englishmen in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 27,000 feet. And as a Canadian and an Anglophile, I became completely hooked. Now, the basic story, of course, is well known to all of you. Britain, having lost the race to the North and South Poles, turned to Everest as the third pole that soared over the Raj, and climbing became an issue of, in a sense, imperial redemption. And the expedition set out as a reconnaissance in 1921 to find the mountain, to find the chink in the armor, to find a route up that would then be exploited in subsequent expeditions that did go out, of course, in 1922 and 1924, and then famously on June 8th, as we've all seen and thought about, those 2 remarkable men on the Northeast Ridge going strong for the summit when the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory in myth. And of course, the question has always been, did they get to the summit before they met their demise? And as John said, I really wasn't interested in that. And perhaps, I grew up in the Canadian Rockies. I was never really a climber, more like a wanderer who frequently found themselves on tops of mountains. But I never thought of myself as a climber. In fact, because of that, I wasn't really concerned about whether they reached the summit of the world. I wanted to know why they walked on. What was it that carried them aloft? And I had the sense that just knowing their class, their education, their age, they had all gone through the agony of the Western Front. And I thought that maybe they had just seen so much of death that death had nothing more to teach them, save that of their own. And what mattered was how one lived, the moments of being alive. It was as if after the war, life was fragile, effervescent, and how you dealt with that determined who you would be. So I decided to set out to try to find out where the men had been during those 4 years and 4 months of their youth. And this journey became, in a sense, a journey through the twilight memories of hell, as Siegfried Sassoon described shell shock. You know, it was famously said of both Passchendaele and the Somme that the British Army lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead. If that was true, they kept records of just about everything else. This war was the most thoroughly chronicled up until that time. And not only was the war thoroughly documented, the field of operations was remarkably small. The British front was never longer than 125 miles, much of the war 85 miles long. Behind that frontage, they built 6,000 miles of trenches, 6,000 miles of railroad. But the entire zone of operations where millions fought and died was the size of the English county of Lincolnshire. And not only was the zone so small, but because the war was chronicled by multiple voices, that kind of tsunami of cathartic literature that came out 10 years after the armistice, poetry, journals, letters, accounts of one sort or another, there was no corner of the battlefield that hadn't been documented in 1,000 different voices. You know, we think of the war by the way of bayonet charges. Bayonets accounted for 1% of casualties. 65% of the boys who died did so simply clinging to the mud of a trench wall as a storm of fire and steel fell above them from the sky. That was the reality of life in the trenches. And not only could you find out where every man had been, you would then know exactly what he had been exposed to. So I set out, and of the men who did fight, who went to Everest, I was able to find out where each man had been every single day of the 4 years and 4 months of the conflict. And that began the kind of sense I had of what this war had meant to an entire generation. Women spoke about it through the metaphor of dance. Diana Manners famously said, by the end of 1916, every boy I had ever danced with was dead. Vera Brittain simply said, and she had lost her brother, her fiance, her 2 best friends, there was no one left to dance with. So if the quest for Mount Everest began as a kind of grand imperial gesture, a redemption for an empire of explorers who had lost the race to the poles, it ended as a mission of regeneration for a country and a people bled white by the war. Of the 26 climbers who went out on the 3 expeditions, 6 escaped the conflict. Sandy too young, Longstaff too old, Bullock a diplomat, Beetham a school teacher, but 20 saw the worst of the fighting. Jack Hazard in 1924 climbed to the top of the North Col with open bleeding wounds from the Battle of the Somme 8 years before, saturating his climbing tunic. 6 had been severely wounded, 2 others nearly killed by disease at the front. 4 as surgeons spent the entire war dealing with the cascades of casualties. 2, Noel, Odell, and Teddy Norton, lost brothers. All had endured the slaughter, the coughing of the guns, the barbed wire, the bones, the white faces of the dead. On the very day that George Mallory disappeared on Everest, Arthur Wakefield and Geoffrey Winthrop Young led a group of the Fell and Rock Climbing Club to the top of Great Gable to dedicate a plaque to all those in the club who had perished in the trenches. Wakefield pulled the Union Jack off. He had begun to speak of the breath of the Moor, and then suddenly began to sob, great cries of grief that were heard across the entire Lake District, and then he stopped in silence. And he never spoke of the war again, and his children would never see the inside of a church, even though he would enter the war as a medical missionary in Newfoundland, a devout Christian. He had brought into being the first 500 of the legendary Newfoundland regiment, and I was able to ascertain from a note that he had written to his wife describing an architectural feature that he had been behind the Somme front on the eve of the debacle of July 1st of 1916. And by chance, his beloved boys of Newfoundland, now he was one of 2 physicians on the entire coast of Labrador, he had brought these boys into the world as a doctor, and they had all come back to join the 29th British Division in its assault on Beaumont Hamel at 9:15 in the morning of July 1st, 1916. 910 boys that he had grown up with, that he had nursed, went over the top. And after that, he couldn't find them. In all the casualty wards, no sign of them. The lilt of their accent, the blue puttees, the insignia of the caribou on their hat. It was like the whole regiment had disappeared. And the problem is, of course, it had. 910 went over, 35 emerged unscathed. At that point, Wakefield lost his Christian faith and would never speak about God again in his life. Howard Somerville, on that same morning of July 1st, walked out from his casualty clearing station, having been told to expect maybe 1,000 casualties in the first week of the battle. He walked out onto his shift with one other surgeon and was surrounded by 6 acres of stretchers and dying boys, and he had to decide who would live and who would die. He never came back from Everest. He became a medical missionary in the south of India and spent the rest of his life saving the living that he might sweep away all memories of the dead. John Noel, who went to his death telling anyone who would listen about his heroic experiences in the Great War. Even his daughter Sandra didn't know that her father had actually spent the entire war in asylums, suffering from shell shock. Here's Mallory and Hereford at Penny Pass. Winthrop Young kept this incredible diary, and in the wake of the war, as Tom Longstaff said, the supply of climbers is not quite what it was before the war. In the Penny Pass diary, there were 23 climbers who would die, 11 who would be so severely wounded they would barely walk again, including Winthrop Young himself, who lost a leg to an Austrian shell on the Italian front. So if the war informed and haunted the lives of the men, the expeditions were not isolated adventures, but intricately interwoven into the destiny of the Raj. Of course, when it came time to attempt Everest in the wake of the war, access through Nepal was, of course, impossible. But to go through Tibet, you had to get permission from the 13th Dalai Lama. And here the problem was that Younghusband in 1903 and 4 had invaded Tibet, destroyed the Tibetan army, driven the 13th Dalai Lama into exile, and now Charles Bell, the frontier officer, was never going to allow the Tibetans to be betrayed again. So in order to get permission, they sent out this extraordinary man, Howard Bury, a soft, gentle soul, a great explorer. He had once anointed his body with oil and walked the length of the Ganga. He had killed a man-eating tiger that had run off with 21 fakirs. He spoke 27 Asiatic languages. In the wake of the Somme, he had been digging a communication trench to Devil's Wood when he almost went mad, because instead of digging through the shock soils of Picardy, he found himself and his men digging through 6 feet of corpses from previous battles. But it was Howard Bury who was able to work with Charles Bell, and permission to go to Tibet in 1921 was part of a complicated diplomatic mission, which included an arms deal that would give power once again to the Tibetan army. So the question became then in 21, who was left to go? Of course, there was George Mallory, but the obvious counterpart, what Mallory was to rock, George Finch was to ice and snow. This was going to be the team. But then 2 weeks before they were to sail, both men were asked to submit to medical examination by the Harley Street physicians, and in this extraordinary moment, George Finch failed. And yet a week later, he set records in the oxygen deprivation tanks up at Cambridge. That summer, he climbed any number of unconquered peaks in the Alps. So what actually was going happening? It was a first-rate scandal of Everest. What happened to George Finch? Well, I looked at sometimes you go to the National Archives to get the stuff, but the really good stuff is in the divorce court records in High Holborn Street. And I looked at the medical records of Finch, and all the doctors were saying is that he looks like shit. That's basically what the reports were, totally subjective. And it turns out that events had taken a tangled turn in his personal life that would have made anyone appear to be, as was reported, sallow complexion, nutrition poor, general appearance tired. All the doctors were saying that he basically looked like hell. Well, what had actually happened is that it began an officer's dance in the spring of 1915 when he met and soon eloped with a coquettish actress called Betty Fisher. They left their addresses no man's land. She went to the English coast to wait out the war. He went off to Salonika to fight, and word reached him that his wife was dying. So he returns to London and finds that not only is she not dying, she's very much alive and the mother of a little boy that clearly is not of his blood, but bears his name. So he goes to France, thrashes the cuckold, comes back, and Betty swears her infinite fidelity, and he then returns to war. He has her watched, and she strays again, but by this point, he doesn't mind because he's fallen in love with a nurse called Gladys May. So as soon as possible, he comes back to London to cut ties with Betty. The divorce comes through in September of 1920. 5 weeks later, he marries Gladys May, who by this point is pregnant with a baby of his blood. And he does the honorable thing and marries her, but here's the problem. He's fallen in love with another woman, Agnes Bubbles Johnson. And he wants to get rid of the second wife. But the judge orders him back to her bed. And so he then sets out to do what a gentleman does in those days. On March 15th, 16th, and 17th, he committed very public adultery with 2 prostitutes in room 477 of the Strand Hotel. That left Gladys with no choice but to allow him his freedom or suffer humiliation. The divorce goes through, and he marries the love of his life, Agnes Bubbles Johnson. Now, it's not clear how much of this is known to the Evers Committee, but on the day of the Harley Street examination, good old George Finch had a few things on his mind. For one, he had been ordered back to the bed of a woman he disdained who was about to give birth to his child. From another disastrous relationship, he had inherited a boy that wasn't of his blood but bore his name, who would grow up to be the famous actor Peter Finch. And to get rid of the second wife, he had promised to pay her 100 quid a year, and he had no money because the family had been lost in the Siberian railway crash in the Russian Revolution. And on the very day of the medical examination, he was scheduled to do adultery in the Strand Hotel in a contrived setup to allow him to marry the woman of his dreams. So as I wrote in the book, it's no wonder he had lost his appetite, and that as the doctors reported, his complexion was indeed sallow. So who does go? Who is there left to go? Well, from this portrait in Darjeeling, it doesn't look like a very heroic bunch. Harold Rayburn on your right, of course, the wonderful Howard Bury, the governor of Bengal, Guy Bullock, George Mallory, and on his right, Sandy Woolston, who looks particularly wussy. But appearances are deceptive. In 1905, he responded to an advertisement in the London Times, left the next day, sailed 3 months to Uganda, spent 9 months in the jungles of the mountains of heaven, the mountains of the moon, and then when he decided to come back to England, he said, why go back the same way? And he walked from the source of the Congo to the mouth, becoming the second man to do it since Stanley. He was later in New Guinea, trying to climb the highest mountain in New Guinea, and he had, like, hundreds of people died on the expedition. They were down to 3 men, only one standing, and they were having dinner, and as they were having dinner, the river was flooding from beneath them, and they're sitting there with their silver set, and the river's coming up, and Sandy says, well, at least we didn't have to bend too hard to wash our dishes that night. I mean, these were extraordinary characters. So they set off, of course, up the Chumbi Valley from Darjeeling. They've got to get to the Tibetan Plateau. They famously walk off the map 362 miles to find their way to a mountain that no European had approached at close quarters. They move through the leech-infested jungles of Sikkim, reach the Tibetan Plateau, and then something very interesting happens. In the shadow of this great fortress of Campazon, Alexander Kellis, 56 years old, high-altitude physiologist, too old for Everest, dies of exhaustion, and he's buried in the shadow of the fort. Oliver Wheeler, seconded from the Survey of India to the expedition, writes in his journal the following morning, well, they buried the old boy in the morning, thought it would be the afternoon, terribly sorry to have missed it, but I do hate funerals. How do you miss the interment of one of the 6 men you're walking across the river? I knew the answer lay on the Western Front. Oliver Wheeler, who by the way would spend more time higher in the mountain, exposed to the wrath of the mountain, his mission was to map the inner massif of the mountain. And he, not George Mallory, found the key to the mountain, the route to the East Roebuck Glacier and the base of the North Col. But he was a soldier. He was in the Indian army that was swept back to France at the beginning of the conflict. By the time they arrived, the British Expeditionary Force had been annihilated. The entire British sector of the front was held by the Canadians in the north, the Indians in the south, and the Germans were sapping the Allied lines, sending trenches perpendicular. And it came to the attention of his command that the Germans had put saps within 30 feet of their front. He was given the order November 14th, 1914, to go over the top, bury those saps, and do so in a way that would dissuade the Germans trying to do this again. Goes over the top, the saps are filled with Germans about to attack them. The result is ferocious hand-to-hand combat that leaves the entire sap, as the Indians push back the Germans, filled with dying boys of both sides, flailing about, as he wrote in his journal, like trout in my cradle. And he had to bury them alive. So when he says on Everest that I do hate funerals, you begin to have a sense of what the war meant and how it seeped into the consciousness of the people. So the expedition reaches Rongbuk. Remember, these are ridge walkers. They have no front-pointing crampons. They basically got to find a saddle that gets to a ridge that gets to the summit. They send Wheeler around to the west to explore the massif. From that side, Mallory and Bullock famously go straight up the Rongbuk. They explore the West Rongbuk. They pick up the North Col from this side, but they don't know how to climb it. They have to get around to the base from the other side, but how do you do that? And famously, Mallory and Bullock walked 3 times past the opening of East Rongbuk and didn't investigate it. And by that point, the expedition has moved around the mountain to Karta to explore the approaches from the east. They climb into the legendary Gama Valley, the hidden valley of Guru Rinpoche, and they begin to march up to Everest, to the Kanchung face. They camp at Petanringbo. They take this photograph of the Kanchung face, which they believe to be utterly unclimbable, and then they come back around to Karta, move up the Karta Valley, and finally find their way to Windy Gap. And that's where Mallory takes this photograph of the North Col across the head of the East Rongbuk Glacier. 4 days later, he writes to his beloved wife, Ruth, and says, if only we knew where this glacier ended up, we would know the key to the mountain. But of course he did, because 2 weeks earlier, Oliver Wheeler's sketch map to Howard Bury had outlined the exact trajectory of the East Rongbuk Glacier. Mallory, and I no offense to the wonderful Mallory family here, he hated Canadians. I'm Canadian. I don't know how you hate a Canadian, but he didn't like Canadians. And he was very disdainful of Oliver Wheeler until, this is what makes George so fantastic, until it came time to do something. And that was to climb the North Col and to get higher than any human being had ever been. And who was the one person he takes from the expedition to go with him? Oliver Wheeler. And with Guy Bullock, they summit to the top of the North Col, and they're met by a hailstorm of wind that nothing they've ever even seen. The only way they survived, they write, is by remembering how they endured the blast of shell fire in the Western Front, closing down your mind, breathing between the gusts of wind, the blast of shells. And they reached higher than anyone had ever gotten, but they had to retreat. And that night, George Mallory stayed up all night long, rubbing Oliver Wheeler's frozen feet with whale oil and kept that man alive. 1922, a powerful expedition. We've got Teddy Norton now, Howard Somerville, and of course, George Finch. They move across the plateau. Wakefield's there. They get to Chegarzong. And here the whole story in 22 is, of course, all about oxygen. People back in London who had never climbed anything higher than their desks somehow think that it's unsporting to use oxygen. Those on the expedition, scientifically minded, like George Finch and Howard Somerville in particular, thought that using oxygen was no different than seeking the finest pair of boots. But what was really going on here was a growing divide between those who still considered climbing to be a sport of gentlemen and a new generation who, because of the war, played in a very different league. The former used the language of war to describe their efforts and intentions on a mountain. The latter had lived through a war that allowed them to walk with grace and commitment at the very edge of death. And in his contribution to the 1922 expedition report, Finch argued that, quote, the margin of safety must be narrowed down, if necessary, to the vanishing point. A climber on Everest must drive himself beyond exhaustion, even to destruction, if need be. And that was what these people, these men brought to the mountain. 1922, they get to the base of North Col, they make their way up. They still don't know that there's no second chances on Everest. Mallory and Norton and Moorshead and Somerville all go up together, leaving George Finch no one to climb with. He selects the general's cousin, Geoffrey Bruce, and they march with oxygen, and they get higher on the mountain and closer to the summit on the mountain than Mallory and his group 2 weeks before. Oxygen clearly is the way. Mallory's not pleased that his height record has been broken, and against the advice of Tom Longstaff, Wakefield authorizes a third attempt. The general acquiesces, and of course, famously, a minute or so after this photograph was taken, the famous avalanche came down and swept to the death the 7 Sherpas. 1924, it's a new game. 2 critical new members, of course, Sandy Irvine and Noel Odell. Odell was a powerful, strong climber. He had lost his own brother Eric in the war. The entire entry in his diary, the day that he learns his brother has died, reads nothing more than this: December 18th, 1916, stayed in hut till tea time, when went across to mess until bedtime. Tonsillitis better, Eric wounded by trench mortar bomb, died 20th. That's it. That's all he says about his brother. And Sandy Irvine, of course, was the great mechanical savant. And there has been some talk over the years of why was Sandy such a prominent member of this team. People have said he had no mountaineering experience. Of course he had. He had been with Odell in the Lake District. He had been in Spitsbergen. He was ferociously strong and athletic. And of course he was a mechanical savant. And there was even, at one point in some literature, the prurient notion that George Mallory somehow had designs on this young man, which suggests not only a total misunderstanding of both George Mallory's sexuality and Sandy's libido. Mallory's emotional bonds to men at Cambridge, even his physical attractions to James Strachey, was just a reflection of his times in a kind of an experimental culture of Cambridge before the war. John Maynard Keynes, for example, was known at Cambridge as the iron copulating machine. And by the time of Everest, of course, George Mallory was a devoted father, a beloved husband, and Sandy Irvine, if you talk to Julie Summers, was wildly and devilishly heterosexual. But if these older men, Mallory and Odell in particular, and certainly Norton and Somerville, appear to have been particularly keen on Sandy, and not merely for the skills he brought to the expedition, the explanation may lie in another realm of unspoken emotion. Sandy was born in 1902. He never served in the army. The war had mercifully ended before, at 16, he would have been eligible for the fight. He wasn't untouched by the conflict. His cousin Edward was killed in France. His brother Hugh, nearby when a German shell exploded in a gas dump, was splattered all over with mustard gas, which etched burns deep into his neck and back. Those open wounds of Sandy's brother would never heal. They would have to be dressed twice a day for the rest of his life until he died in 1965. Odell and Norton both lost brothers at the front. Somerville had struggled through acres of dying boys. All of them had borne witness to the carnage. And I think if they were powerfully drawn to young Sandy, it was because in his joy, his vitality, his innocence and youth, he embodied all that they had fought for and the very future for which so many of their friends had died. So Sandy and Mallory were particularly close. Here, gazing towards Everest from the Pangla, reaching up at last in 1924 to the North Col. 1924 had horrendous weather conditions, unbelievable precipitation of snow that beat them back not once but 3 times, eventually forcing them, for the sake of the Sherpa, to seek the spiritual blessings of Zathru Rinpoche at Rongbuk. Zatro, who in his Namtar, his spiritual autobiography, referenced these climbs with one single line: "I was so sorry that men suffered so much for such a stupid purpose." Because from the Tibetan point of view, to climb into the death zone where oxygen deprivation obliterates consciousness and eliminates the possibility of revelation and transcendence and enlightenment in one lifetime is just about the most foolish thing you can do with the precious incarnation. But with this blessing, of course, with the ladder crafted of rope by Sandy, they make their way back up, and now the story is known well to all of you. This famous image of Norton going up taken by Somerville saving Norton in the couloir when he becomes dizzy and stumbles back down. On the way down, Howard Somerville literally coughing up the entire frozen lining of his larynx and lungs and throat, like a woman giving birth to a placenta, coughing up onto the ground, bleeding, and continuing to walk down. And then famously on the next fateful day, Sandy and George take off for the summit. And here's a photograph of the team in Darjeeling in the wake of the disaster. And Norton's language is really interesting. He said, as they abandoned Rongbuk, "We were a sad little party. From the first we accepted the loss of our comrades in that rational spirit which all of our generation had learned in the Great War. There was never any tendency to a morbid harping on the irrevocable, but the tragedy was very near. As so constantly in the war, so here in our Minute campaign, death had taken its toll from the best." And that very night, as the expedition retreated from Rongbuk, one of them, it was actually Bentham, I think, looked out the tent, and he spoke for all as he looked over the entire Rongbuk Valley and all the glory of Everest. He said, "I could see the whole of the historic ground, the scene of the protracted adventure, spread out like a map and bathed in soft, full moonlight. And what a strange, impelling light it is." That night, and with that scene in front of one, it was quite easy to realize that the price of life is death, that so long as a payment be made promptly, it matters little to the individual when the payment is made. Somewhere up there in that vast wilderness of ice and rock were two still forms. Yesterday, with all the vigor of perfect manhood, they were playing a great game. Today it's over, and they had gone without their ever knowing the beginnings of decay. Could any man desire a better end? Well, did Mallory make it to the top? I'll leave that to Mark and Conrad and Jake and John and people with a whole lot more experience on that mountain than I have. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. They did manage to climb higher than anyone had ever climbed, a height record that would stand for 30 years. Conrad in his book brings up a wildly wonderful possibility if the snow that had pounded the mountain in that unusual year had accumulated on the second step. Could it be that there was incline that could have allowed them to walk up with the speed that Odell famously reported? Probably not, but it's an idea too delicious to completely ignore. And I can only say that had Mallory been able to surmount that impediment, I have a sense that he would have walked on even to his end, because for him, as for all of his generation, death was but, as one young soldier wrote back to his father in the wake of his brother's death on the Western Front, "Father, death here is but a frail barrier that men cross smiling and gallant every day." These men had seen so much of death that life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And I think in the end, the most important thing for all of us in this year, the 100th anniversary of their loss, is to remember just what kind of men these climbers were. It's not because of the horror of the war. In what Churchill would call the blood-stained century of violence, much more terrible things would come. It's rather that we look back on the character of these men, a kind of man we'll never know again. These, after all, were men of decency, honor, discretion, and decorum, who were not prepared to yield their feelings to analysis, who had no interest whatsoever with littering the world with themselves. And yet they were so confident in their masculinity that they could speak of love between men without shame, collect butterflies for the British Museum in the dawn, paint watercolors before lunch, discuss Keats, Shelley, Byron over lunch, and still be prepared to assault the flanks of Everest, or indeed the German front lines at dusk. They're a kind of man of integrity that we will probably never know again. And the most amazing thing for us to remember is that for many of us, these men were our grandfathers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you. Thank you. I think we could have listened to Wade for another hour. But thank you, everybody. Thank you, Wade. Thank you, Mark, Conrad, and everybody that came here this evening to support us. And I think last year was 70th anniversary. This year was 100. I don't know what we'll do next year, but we'll figure something out. So thank you for coming. Have a great evening, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.